Hi, I'm Jen Wang, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Simon Fraser University. Thank you for listening to my talk, Social Ontology in Early Confucian Philosophy. This is part of a 2-year SSHRC-funded project in early Chinese metaphysics, which I should warn viewers is in its very early stages. I'm going to use this talk to introduce the project more broadly, in addition to exploring a specific idea. The historical period I'm concerned with is the Eastern Zhou dynasty in ancient China, which, by the way, was not quite yet China as we know it. This period was characterized by military unrest. 5 nation-states dominated in the spring and autumn period. Then, in the Warring States period, the 7 main nation-states were, at war. China was finally quote-unquote unified in 221 BCE by the state of Qin. This marked the beginning of the Qin dynasty, which is regarded as China's first true dynasty. Early Chinese philosophy flourished during the Eastern Zhou dynasty. My focus will be on Confucius, who lived during the spring and autumn period. The name Confucius is a romanization of Kongzi, or Kongfuzi, which translates to Master Kong, Kong being his family name. Confucius belonged to the so-called traveling scholar social class, and served as an advisor to various aristocratic families in the state of Lu. The primary text associated with Confucius is the Analects, or Linyu, a book of quotations and dialogues attributed to Confucius by his followers. Confucianism continued to flourish during the Warring States period. 2 notable Confucians were Mengzi, or Mencius as he's known, and Xunzi. Unlike the Analects, their writings more explicitly contained philosophical argumentation. And of course, being philosophers, they disagreed, most notably over human nature. Confucianism is actually a tradition that spans many centuries, from Confucius's time to the present day, and has also influenced the cultures of many geographic regions outside of China, especially in East Asia. There is also a long tradition of commentaries. However, I will only talk about the Analects in this presentation. There was a lot of interesting philosophy during this period beyond Confucianism that I won't be able to talk about, including the first known development of consequentialism in the world by the Mohists, or Wujia. And many people have at least heard of Taoism, or Daojia. I will not be talking about this tradition in ancient China either. So here is the plan for the rest of this talk. First, I'll introduce just a few of the many themes in the Analects, to give viewers unfamiliar with this text an idea of what it contains. While philosophical in nature, this text is not thought to contain any particular metaphysical views. Rather, it has an explicitly practical, moral, and political orientation. I claim that the Analects in fact supports various metaphysical theses, specifically theses in social ontology. I will begin to describe one of these theses in detail, first by introducing Charlotte Witt's views on social individuals, and then by suggesting a conception of social individuals based on the Analects. I will close with some ideas about where this project might go. As mentioned, the Analects, or Linyu, is a text consisting of quotations, many of which are attributed to Confucius, or the Master. It is comprised of 20 chapters. Some parts are organized thematically, but most of it is not. One important concept in the Analects is that of the exemplary person, or junzi, which literally means son of a ruler and is sometimes translated as gentleman. The opposite of the exemplary person is the petty person, or xiaozhen, or literally small person. The exemplary person, unlike the petty person, has the virtue of goodness, or zan. This term is also translated as humaneness or benevolence. Goodness is considered the most important of the Confucian virtues. Other Confucian virtues include wisdom, humility, righteousness, dutifulness, trustworthiness, and courage. Note that Confucius is sometimes said to be a virtue theorist, but we should be careful not to simply shoehorn his view in with contemporary virtue ethics. It is difficult to become an exemplary person, as this requires a long process of self-cultivation. Confucius himself expressed this modesty on having reached this pinnacle, as in 733. On this slide, I've also included a panel from a collection of illustrations that I like by C.C. Cai. Another important Confucian concept is that of ritual, or li, which is also translated as rites or etiquette. Ritual includes not just ceremonial rituals, but rules of conduct more generally. 10.2 and 10.25 illustrate that sometimes what conduct is appropriate varies depending on the situation and the persons involved. The purpose of ritual is not the activity itself, but some social or psychological goal. 10.12 is used by Confucius's critics to illustrate an overly rigid adherence to ritual. He would not sit unless his mat was straight. However, 9.3 paints a different picture. It illustrates that it is not the activity of the ritual itself that matters, but what it conveys, which is often the appropriate feeling or attitude such as humility or respect. Confucius thought adherence to ritual is the path to acquiring goodness. Of crucial ethical importance to Confucius is the family. Early Confucians recognized 5 basic relationships with moral significance between father and son, husband and wife, older brother and younger brother, ruler and subject, and teacher and student. And actually, these aren't the only important relationships. For instance, the family, especially the mother, is responsible for the moral upbringing of a child via modeling virtuous thought and behavior. To illustrate the relationship between father and son, in 1318, Confucius is talking to a local lord who says, "Among my people there is one we call upright Gong. When his father stole a sheep, he reported him to the authorities." Confucius then replies, "Among my people, those we consider upright are different from this. Fathers cover up for their sons, and sons cover up for their fathers. This is what it means to be upright." In general, the Confucian doctrine of differentiated caring states that one has stronger moral obligation towards one's own family. This is called filiality or filial piety. 1.2, 1.6, and 4.20 provide illustration. I've now given viewers an idea of some of the main themes of the Analects, though there is of course much more in this text and in the subsequent commentaries on it. Overall, as viewers have seen, the Analects has an explicitly practical, moral, and political orientation. It is not thought by scholars to contain any metaphysics, or at least not the kind of metaphysics being practiced in many leading philosophy departments in North America. Some scholars of early Chinese philosophy have even gone so far as to deny that early Chinese thinkers recognized concepts such as truth or essence. Ed Slingerland has a fascinating book that seeks to debunk many such myths about early China. There can be scholarly disagreement about the details of the metaphysical views contained in early Chinese texts, of course, but I agree with Slingerland that many go too far. This is not to say that nobody has argued that there is early Chinese metaphysics, but insofar as metaphysical theses are discussed, most of the work has not centered on early Confucian texts, like the Analects, the Mencius, and the Xunzi. Scholars have instead discussed the interplay of language, logic, and ontology, especially in the school of names, concepts like patterns, reality, and nature, especially in early Taoist texts, and the relation between mind and body in early Chinese thought. These are concepts recognized by contemporary metaphysicians, even if the presentation of such ideas looks idiosyncratic from the contemporary perspective. I contend that the metaphysical import of early Confucian texts, like the Analects, has been overlooked due to a narrow conception of what falls under the scope of metaphysical inquiry. In recent years, metaphysicians have started paying attention to issues in social ontology, including theorizing about social construction, social groups, and social individuals. As mentioned, this project is in its early stages. I view it as a response to pleas from scholars of early Chinese philosophy for contemporary philosophers to acknowledge, respect, and engage with non-Western philosophical traditions. It also aligns with calls to broaden the scope of metaphysics to include social ontology. My own background is in that part of metaphysics that deals with concepts like modality and fundamentality, and I do love that sort of philosophy, but I also think that this new project is really important. In the next part of this presentation, I will describe a specific idea related to this project that engages with Charlotte Witt's views about social individuals. In her book, The Metaphysics of Gender, Charlotte Witt argues for an intriguing thesis. Where we previously thought there was one individual a person, there are actually 3. Persons are individuals that have the first-person perspective, which is, according to Witt, the ability to think of oneself as oneself, and that have autonomy, which, according to Witt, is a kind of inner self-legislation or self-conscious regulation of our desires, decisions, and actions. Persons are the loci of rights and responsibilities. Human organisms are members of the human species, that is, they realize the human genotype. And social individuals are social position occupiers, as in doctor, parent, or immigrant. They stand in social relations essentially and are capable of intentional behavior. A single social individual can, of course, occupy multiple social positions. Witt argues that these are three distinct individuals in virtue of having different persistence and identity conditions. The differing identity conditions have been explained. To see that they have different persistence conditions, consider Charlie. Charlie is a human organism throughout his life. Arguably, he was not a person at birth, but he is now, or will be. And although Charlie is a fully social individual, we could easily imagine him being born to a very different social world, like wolf society, or, less easily, to no social world at all. Or so Witt claims. Of course, we only have one name that we apply to our trinity of individuals, but Witt presumably thinks this is an artifact of language or of our psychology. Ontologically speaking, these three individuals often coincide. To understand this idea, let me take a brief detour through the metaphysical puzzle of the statue and the lump of clay. At 8 a.m., Charlie begins work on a lump of clay. By noon, he has shaped the clay into a statue. But then, at 4 p.m., in a fit of rage, he smushes the statue back into a formless lump. The puzzle arises because the statue and the lump of clay have different persistence conditions. The clay can survive smushing, but the statue cannot. Yet, they seem to materially coincide. At noon, the statue and the clay both exist and have all of the same material parts. One solution to this puzzle is to say that the lump of clay constitutes the statue. Constitution, according to some philosophers, is a relation of ontological dependence. The statue is not identical to the lump of clay, but nonetheless consists in or depends upon it. Witt extends this idea to her trinity. On her view, the human organism constitutes both the social individual and the person. So these three individuals are distinct but intimately connected. Viewers might have immediately thought of objections to Witt's trinity. We'll come back to this. For now, focus on the following question. Even granting that social individuals are distinct from human organisms and persons, why think that Charlie is one social individual rather than many? He is a son, a daycare student, a truck enthusiast, and a gardener. Witt argues that these social positions are unified in virtue of the normative priority of just one of the social positions over the others. Gender, that is, being a man or a woman, or in Charlie's case, a boy. Persons, human organisms, and social individuals are governed by different kinds of normativity in virtue of the kind of thing that they are. In particular, social individuals are governed by social normativity, which, Witt says, requires the recognition by others that an individual is obligated to obey or fulfill the norm. What does it mean for gender to have normative priority over other social roles? First, its normative requirements override those of other roles. For instance, the norms governing Charlie's role as a truck enthusiast are different than the norms governing a girl's role as a truck enthusiast. It is because he is a boy that his truck enthusiasm is judged in one way, a generally positive light, rather than another, a potentially negative light. Keep in mind that these norms are highly variable depending on the context, so this is not being asserted as a necessary truth in any general sense. Not only do others judge Charlie in a particular way, qua boy in all of his social roles, he himself may be aware of these norms and adjust his behavior accordingly. The second way in which gender has normative priority over other social roles is in that it defines and organizes the other roles. It is thought to be more important or appropriate that Charlie perform his role as a truck enthusiast than as a gardener, no matter how much he himself may value these roles. And again, he may be aware of this norm and may accordingly adjust his preferences, though I doubt it because Charlie tends to do whatever he wants. And why does gender have normative priority? Witt's answer is that gender, unlike other social roles, is lifelong and central to an individual's social life. Witt, of course, argues more for this claim, the details of which I will have to ignore here. There is, in fact, quite a bit I've left out, but I hope this brief introduction to some of Witt's views will be enough for our purposes for the connection to early Confucian philosophy. In the next part of this talk, I will question the distinction between the normativity of social individuals and of persons in the context of early Confucianism. Witt remains neutral about the nature of ethical normativity, but she does concede that it is often attributed to what she calls persons. What's important for her view is that there is a distinctive kind of normativity, social normativity, that applies to social individuals rather than persons. Social normativity, on her view, is ascriptivist rather than voluntarist. It is grounded in others rather than oneself. For her, ethical normativity is the reverse, voluntarist rather than ascriptivist. But we can set aside these parts of her view. What matters here is that these two kinds of normativity apply to different individuals and have different sources. From an early Confucian point of view, this is highly puzzling, for early Confucians do not distinguish ethical and social normativity, or so I claim. The doctrine of differentiated caring states that one has stronger moral obligations towards one's own family. One's moral obligations are inextricably linked to one's social position in a way that I think cannot be accommodated by Witt's views. For the early Confucian view seems to be that the social world is at least partly the source of ethical normativity. This contrasts with views on which one navigates the world with attention to social norms, but where social normativity may ultimately be trumped by an ethical normativity that has a different source. I think that this is Witt's position, though I have to admit I'm not sure. She does draw connections between the social and the ethical, but this seems to require going through the three different individuals involved in one so-called quote-unquote self. Here I have to admit that sorting this out is on my list of things to do, for Witt makes rather complicated claims about the self-embodiment and practical identities. But I don't think these considerations will ultimately contradict the view that social and ethical normativity ultimately have different sources, for Witt. In an article comparing early Confucianism with Aristotelian ideas, Joel Kupperman describes the ways in which parental modeling and rituals, including music, which was important for early Confucians, contribute to the ethical development of an individual. The first passage on the slide describes the ways in which tradition and community play a causal role in ethical development. But Kupperman also writes, "Are these things merely causes of the person one becomes? It is hard to deny that they become, generally speaking, constitutive." I should note that this talk of becoming constitutive may sound odd to the contemporary metaphysician who thinks that if one thing constitutes another, then it does so with necessity, maybe not metaphysical necessity, but perhaps some other strength of necessity. But Kupperman's language is consonant with the common interpretation that early Confucians had an understanding of human nature that develops over time rather than is atemporal or eternal. I also plan to explore this in future work. I'll end this presentation with a brief list of ideas on where to go from here. First, if ethical and social normativity cannot be so sharply distinguished, according to early Confucians, then it may be that we should not distinguish persons and social individuals. Getting here requires more assumptions that I intend to explore. Another potential idea comes from discussions of early Confucian role ethics. Two prominent scholars of early Chinese philosophy, Roger Ames and Henry Rosemont Jr., have argued that the early Confucians endorsed a role ethics in which persons are constituted by the roles that they live. This apparently has ontological implications, though these implications are not always clearly stated. Finally, Alexis MacLeod has argued that in early Confucian texts, the virtue of goodness, or zhen, should be understood as a property of communities rather than individuals. Given the importance of goodness in early Confucian thought, this suggests that communities are in fact more fundamental than individuals, or that goodness may be an emergent property. Again, I have to leave viewers with only a promissory note to explore these ideas. I welcome constructive feedback on the project and am looking forward to our conversation. Thank you!